and welcome to the Agora Politics podcast. This is your host, Alex Murshak. With me today is returning guest and friend of the show, Cody Moser. Cody, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here.
It's so good to have you. And, the last time we talked, I believe, was back in August, something like that. And then prior to that, it was right around the beginning of the pandemic. And so we're actually in the process of forming this like weird little thread of interactions right now with regard to the state of the coronavirus. It seems as if we're finally at the point where this nightmare might be actually over for good. I'm here in Michigan. I'm not sure where exactly in the country you are, but it seems like, at least here, despite our governor's best efforts, things are finally starting to open back up, and at least the businesses are getting more comfortable with people coming in, whether you're vaccinated, whether you're not vaccinated. Most of the stores around me are at least requesting that you are fully vaccinated if you come in without a mask. But as far as I know, none of them are like very hardcore about it. They're not asking you to show your papers or anything. How's the state of affairs where you're at?
Well, I'm in Florida, so
So it's
everything's open.
free for all. It's a party down there.
Yeah, if your business is not open at this point, it's probably by choice.
Hmm.
A lot of people are wearing masks by choice. It's a little safer than I think the news is making it out to be. But definitely everything's open right now, including government buildings, every business. Everyone's pretty much good to go, I think.
Yeah, and it's so funny because the states that were very anti-lockdown, like Texas and Florida, turned out not to really be suffering that much, or even that much more, sometimes even less than some of the states that went more hardcore. And I think, the truth will bear out eventually on all of this stuff. So, hopefully the politicians that took irresponsible actions towards their citizens and towards their economies will pay consequences for doing that. Anyway, that is not the topic of our main show today. I just wanted to jump into that briefly because we are in different parts of the country, and I always like to use that as an opportunity to ask about what's going on where other people are located and just sort of compare. Part of the beauty of our federalist system is that we have different states and they're all doing different experiments in governance, and we get to see which ones are working out best. And as long as there's still freedom of movement, which there is to some extent right now still, we can choose to go where we'd like and go to where our policies and preferences are better suited. That being said, today's topic is not related to the coronavirus, so we're going to cut out that chatter for now. I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about science, and in particular, uh, something we call scientism, which is sort of related to many of the, I'd say, claims and different narratives that have popped up, in particular over the last year around coronavirus. But it's not simply limited to the pandemic. Scientism, or really blind faith in certain assumptions in science, or treating science as if it is a set of beliefs that you sort of adapt and then you go through the world following them rather than uh, adhering to the core principles of science, which are, in my opinion, based around more of a process orientation and a sort of consensus building that happens over time and that is always subject to refutation, even by a small minority. Um, Scientism is something that's very, very old, maybe as old as the scientific enterprise itself. And more particularly, we're also going to get into assumptions underlying materialism today. There is a subject who is the core focus of our discussion, which is Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a molecular biologist and plant pathologist. Uh, and before we get into Rupert Sheldrake and his sort of criticisms of science and the way in which it's become kind of ideology in our time and even before that a little bit, I wanted to just briefly have, for those of you who maybe haven't met you before, although we've talked a number of times now, uh, a brief introduction to yourself, your credentials, your academic work, and what you've been up to.
Yeah, sure. So as we sort of introduced me earlier, my name's Cody. I'm a PhD student at the University of California, Merced, in their cognitive and information sciences department. Although, I guess in my case, is the information sciences is doing a lot more weight than the cognitive, because I'm very new to the cognitive sciences. My background is largely in anthropology. I used to study primate behavior and a bunch of other things, and then I got into this field of cultural evolution and kind of evolutionary psychology, understanding uh, why it is that we act the way that we are and where some of these traits came from in our evolutionary past.
Mhm.
Um, right now, I'm working on a few different things. I work on things pertaining to like the evolution of music and language. So, for example, like our interactions with animals and how maybe that might have some kind of implication for our language systems. You kind of go around the world. It sounds kind of crackpotish, but you go around the world to like hunter gatherers and traditional tribes and things like that. And while most of the times we're communicating in these Western industrialized societies, we're communicating with other people, but people, out in the real world, I'll call it, communicate with animals all the time, usually to deceive them. So, like prey calls, so, mimicking birds so that other birds come so you can kill them, or, rattling antlers together so that deer think that other deer are fighting to attract them and also kill them. People do that vocally all the time. But aside from that, and in more recent projects, and why I kind of moved to a new academic department for my PhD is I'm working on um, models of cultural evolution, and specifically in terms of innovation and institutions. So, kind of my core question is, how did we get all of this nice stuff that we have? Like, we're talking on a computer right now, thousands of miles away from each other. How did we get that, and how do we get more of it? And that's pretty much what I'm interested in now. So,
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I think also this aspect of cultural evolution is going to be very relevant to our talk today because there is always this sort of split between those who think of science as a process and those who think of science as an institution. I saw there was a paper released not too long ago about vaccine skeptics, and there had been sort of an infiltration, supposedly, into the various vaccine skeptic online communities. I think mostly they were on Facebook, but also elsewhere, by a group of scientists. I don't remember where they were from. I think maybe it was MIT. And what they found was that one of the core beliefs of these vaccine skeptic communities was that they thought of science as a more of the process rather than an institution, which is really really funny, coming on down high from these MIT scientists. That would be a surprise to them, and that they would consider that a difference between them. Now, of course, science is both of those things in our colloquial use of the term. How do you think about the history of the development of science and its place as an institution versus a method for, let's say, verifying and propagating truth?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, you know, you and I have spoken a little bit about this topic of knowledge bearing institutions. That if you go back far enough back in time, there were always groups of people, or even one person in a group, who had access to knowledge that other people didn't have. Whether this was because it was things that maybe other people couldn't know. So, like, for example, you think about shamans in some of the earliest hunter gatherer society. The point of the shaman is that he can communicate with a realm that most people really don't have access to. But over time, you do get certain other systems that arise. The big one for me that I often think of is like the monastic system in medieval Europe. For many, many years, you had these institutions that were set aside from the rest of the world, and their only job was to sit there and focus on the knowledge that had been collected in years past. Eventually, all these other systems go away, and something else replaces them. Something that has to be the, I guess, main, vanguard of knowledge in society. And it seems, as of recent years, that would be the university system. It is pretty interesting, though, that the university system didn't necessarily really start with science. It was kind of at the tail end of the monastic system that the university system came to. As monasteries started loaning out their books, and as the printing press started copying the books that the monasteries so coveted, other people had access to them, and more books ended up in more centralized places. You had libraries, Then you had universities, and people just wanted to know what other people thought about the world in years past. Science came much, much later. And what's interesting is that science obviously is a process, but the process itself has become canalized in this like medieval university institution, and we often don't realize that. That really one of the big things about capital S science is that it's able to sit there and gatekeep knowledge and what passes through the entire scientific process without really, you know, what's the word I was going to think of? Any second checks on their system, in a sense, because they do have that institutional pull.
Well, so I'll just stop you right there before you go to the next part. Without any second checks, meaning outside verification, verification by those who are not well embedded and sort of verified and authorities, not only inside of the scientific enterprise, but often is the case inside of very particular and narrow disciplines or fields. When we talk about things like the peer review process, those are very insular, often very circular types of knowledge production ecosystems that only involve a very very small number of persons who are given the right or the ability to verify and to choose to accept or reject gatekeeping function, like you said there. Uh, what gets passed through the system and even has the opportunity to be checked off as science or not science. Uh, I'm sorry, I'll let you continue from there.
Well, yeah, yeah, no, I mean that's kind of the point is that yeah, the in a sense they've gate kept it enough that in order to participate in the activity of science, you also have to participate in the institution. It's not often that you see, well, say back in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you saw this a lot. Private industry publishing in journals. You don't see that so much anymore. It's pretty rare. Sometimes you see like nonprofit, almost think tanks publishing things like that. But again, it's mostly university based people who publish scientific papers.
Hmm. And so before we jump right into the man of the hour, now I'm gonna have to preface his introduction with some qualifications, just so that everybody knows that we're not just talking about some random crank. Although I would say that the word crank itself has sort of been weaponized to sort of demonize certain scientific thinkers who dare to kind of question some of the assumptions and dogmas that are attendant to the scientific community. You yourself are not an outsider. You're well within a number of institutions, but you have yourself encountered certain kinds of dogmatism, certain kinds of ideological strains. And here I'm not talking in particular about political ideology, although that is increasingly a problem where it used to not be as well so much. Do you want to just talk a little bit about this issue uh, of acceptability within the institutions and sort of the need to conform in order to climb the let's say just the hierarchies within these institutions, as far as you've seen it from your own experience?
Yeah, sure. My background is in anthropology, and if there's a field that kind of forces you to conform, that's the number one field I would say. Um, my I talk about this with a professor of mine all the time, which is that you go to all kinds of fields like say psychology or biology, and if people have disagreements, they stake it out in papers, and that's the end of it. But you go into anthropology, and where disagreements arise, you're either a postmodernist who doesn't think that gravity's real, or you're a fascist who wants to say that everyone basically has a monkey brain. And that's pretty much it. Once that disagreement comes in, it's like, okay, you have to pick a side, and once you're on it, it's done. Anthropology in particular had a bad time with the science wars, which was a period like in the 1990s to early 2000s almost, between the postmodernist perspectives, people who were skeptical of the scientific process and scientific papers that were coming out, and those who said, no, anthropology is a science. We can study people using the scientific method. And that rift really hasn't been healed at all in anthropology. Recently, there was, or not recently, it was maybe 2 years ago, the American Anthropological Association, which is kind of the big organization for cultural anthropology, published a paper saying, hey, biological anthropologists, all you people who study skeletons and genetics, why don't you come back and publish in our journals again? And I published a blog post saying, hey, this might be a good idea, get some consilience back, get everyone to start agreeing after the science wars are done. And I had some colleagues who, lived through the science wars, and they said, no, no, no. I'll never publish in their journal. They don't see me as a scientist, and I don't see them as one either. I don't want to talk to them. So in that case, it's like, yeah, you kind of do have to toe the line there. Um,
Hmm. Well, so there is obviously these factional debates. I think there's sort of a tendency or a bias for everyone to think that their field is the worst field in this regard. And as someone who does not come from a particularly scientific field myself, my field is more closely aligned with political science or philosophy. We don't really pretend to be scientists. And although most philosophers, I think, would argue that you can't really do science without philosophy. And so you actually have to have really good philosophy of science underpinning your methodology if you want to arrive at truth and if you want to be logically consistent and have something that's verifiable and replicable throughout. And in fact, briefly, you mentioned there the split among the postmodernists. I'm noticing in at least the broader discourse, or at least the discourse on Twitter, that there is also the split among sort of those who are sort of staunch. Well, we'll say I won't even say modern. Well, I'll say modernists, right? There are sort of these modernists and a postmodernist split. There are kind of other factions like meta modernists that are popping up, and I've had a number of meta modernists on this show as well, which is I would say sort of an attempt at sort of synthesizing those perspectives a little bit. Um, but one of the things that's interesting to me here, and that's relevant for our conversation today, is that the critiques that postmodernists offer, despite the fact that they maybe don't have as much respect for, let's say, the rigor that might be involved in those who are in opposition to them, is that they actually are quite useful for sort of tearing apart any kind of dogmatic structures that might be there. And so one of the things that I sort of keep returning to is that there are a lot of people, in particular in the political realm, who are saying, look, these postmodernists are trying to apply their theories to our conceptions of politics, to our conceptions of rights and justice, and all these sort of sacred values of political philosophy, and they're complaining that they're ruining the field and that they're creating all kinds of problems, and we need to just sort of, if we could just expel all the postmodern thinking, then we could go back to our perfect state of nature, which apparently existed before the post structuralists. But but my thinking is, look, we can't just pretend that they didn't exist and that they haven't put forward their critiques. We have to actually deal with those critiques as they are. And if it's true that our ideas can't stand up to those critiques, then we ought to find out why. So, as I was saying, uh, it's not that we can just sort of do away with these postmodernists, and they might actually have some interesting critiques that we ought to deal with. Uh, how do you think about the encroachment by sort of postmodern, post structuralist theories that really came out of sort of literary genres or artistic genres of academia, encroaching on, well, not only your field but also natural sciences and other fields as well.
when I was first exposed to this stuff, I thought it was like um, an immediate disaster. I thought it was the worst thing that could have ever happened because I was kind of one of these staunch, Popperite believers that it's like, no, the scientific process is pure, and if we just follow those rules a little bit better, then we will come to arrive at the correct truth. I was always like, this Foucault guy is a fraud. All of them are frauds. They're just saying nice things, and to an extent, I do think a few of them took it a little too far. In anthropology, for example, we had Clifford Geertz, and Geertz did something that really upsets me. I'm kind of fine with this, almost literary perspective for looking at the world or social sciences and things like that. On one condition, which is you can't tell me I can't use science in the meantime. That's my only problem. But, recently I have really come to agree with a good number of their ideas. I read, for example, Paul Feyerabend's book, Against Method, and that kind of flipped my whole worldview upside down from this, rationalist perspective to saying, maybe there's something to what these guys are saying. Feyerabend's idea was, hey, philosophy of science isn't just philosophy of science. We have to understand how it is historically that the best science got through. And he says, really, a lot of times this is pretty absent of the scientific process. So he talks about how Galileo pretty much lied his way through to getting the Copernican revolution started. In many ways, the original view of the planets was more accurate for what tools they had for the time. Galileo was proposing something that at the time really couldn't be measured with what they had. It didn't work out in many ways. He was taking the exact same results of previous experiments and saying, no, look, their results actually confirm what I say, and simply just reinterpreting the end result to say, okay, I'm right. And what's interesting about it is that in that case, science ended up still working out. Things didn't really follow the scientific process in the way that you would have expected it to. But again, it worked out. Foucault is another one who's pretty interesting. I think he gets a bad rep in many places where he shouldn't. Because he didn't say, oh, knowledge is just power and knowledge is only power. He says that in many cases, knowledge formulation comes as a result of wanting more power or using knowledge to get more power. He's not saying, oh, all these facts you know about the world are false. He's just saying, well, think about the ways that they arise. And you see this all the time. I mean, especially like in the last year or so, let's say, for example, this idea of the lab leak theory. I'm not going to sit here and talk like some kind of expert. I really don't understand that so much. But what I do know is that when that theory first came out, media was saying, this is a conspiracy theory. Fauci was debunking it in front of Congress. Many scientists were saying, massive threads on Twitter saying, I'm going to tell you why Trump's theory is wrong. And now it seems like the tide has turned a little bit on it from saying this is just a completely fraudulent conspiracy theory to saying, maybe there's something to it. And, I'm not going to sit here and say I think it is true or not. I don't know enough. But what's really interesting about that phenomena is the fact that people said it's false in a way to kind of, I would say, detract from the person who was saying it was a thing, who at the time was Trump, to kind of tear him down a little bit. And in the process, tore knowledge down altogether.
Yeah, it's sort of sacrificing their principles and really their credibility. Many of the virologists and epidemiologists there who were staunchly opposed to that theory and demonizing the people who were even entertaining it are really just sacrificing their credibility and the credibility of their field at the altar of political expedience. And so I think that's actually a good example here of why this conversation is so important. People might be wondering, why are we having a conversation about science, scientism, materialism more generally on a podcast that's supposedly about politics? And the reason is that science is a one method that we have of making sense of the world. And it, at least for a long time, has been the most powerful one we could find. And so it has bearing on our political communities. It has bearing on our epistemological coherence, that we understand science properly, and that those who are entrusted to communicate science to the public are doing so faithfully and are also not being corrupted by different ideological worldviews, whether those are political or otherwise. So, with all of that being said, I think we've set the stage properly then to get into the main topic today, which is this scientist, molecular biologist, and that is Rupert Sheldrake. Rupert Sheldrake is a biochemist with an interest in plant physiology. He holds degrees in natural sciences, a master's in natural science from Clare College, Cambridge. He was also a Frank Knox Fellow in Philosophy and the History of Science at Harvard, as well as a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge. And that's just a little bit of his credentials there, so that people know that this guy that we're talking about is not some quack who's conducting experiments in his garage. Although I would say that from a pure scientific perspective, we wouldn't necessarily be opposed to that either, as long as it was sound and replicable. Um, but this is a serious scientist who has some serious credentials. And of course, I already mentioned earlier in this conversation that the crank slur always gets thrown around when these elder scientists start throwing their weight around and decide that they finally have enough clout to start speaking freely. He has certainly been demonized himself as a crank. And if you go to his Wikipedia page, they will give you a not so flattering summary from the beginning. They don't even introduce him as a scientist. I think they introduce him as like an author and a conspiracy theorist or something or other like that. But you have known about Rupert Sheldrake a little bit longer than I have. I only recently discovered his work and his ideas several months ago, and I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. But do you want to just give a brief introduction of your view of Rupert Sheldrake and how you came to discover him?
Yeah, sure. To me, Sheldrake's kind of an interesting figure. Um, my interest in Sheldrake comes from kind of this side interest I have in scientific renegades. So, like for example, um, kind of one of my scientific heroes is Freeman Dyson. And one of the reasons I love Freeman Dyson so much is because he was just one of these people who would just be like, say the most outlandish stuff, just so that he could push the envelope a little bit more. And in a sense, I think science needs people like that. Every once in a while, we have to let, and I'll use this term, we have to let the cranks in. We have to let them just say what they say and push it to the limit, so that we can figure out, where they're wrong or where they might be right. I'll give you a great example. B.F. Skinner. B.F. Skinner was kind of the father, or rather the torchbearer for this idea in psychology called
Mm-hmm.
behaviorism. Behaviorism was this idea that in order to understand psychology, in order to understand the human mind, all you have to understand is behavior as a system of inputs to a system and then outputs. So, why are we influenced by things in our environment and what does it cause? And Skinner at the time was saying, I don't have to understand anything about the mind to understand behavior. What's really interesting is that during a dinner conversation, a philosopher went up to not Rupert Sheldrake, to B.F. Skinner, and he said, "Hey, Skinner, you really think you can explain everything with behaviorism?" And Skinner was like, "Yeah, of course." And the philosopher said, "Okay, explain this to me." And he just said some nonsense sentence to him. He said something like, "There is not a black scorpion falling upon this table." That was the sentence. And B.F. Skinner, that basically sent him into an existential crisis. And for like the next 20 years, he spent a book trying to answer this guy's one question. And in the book, he basically says, I can define language in terms of the behavioral process. And his answer comes like, towards the end of the book, he says, well, the scorpion represented behaviorism and, you're dropping it on the table. But the whole point is that the book was absurd. B.F. Skinner kind of really pushed the boundaries in terms of how far he could take behaviorism. And one of the people who critiqued it was a fellow named Noam Chomsky. And Noam Chomsky said, hey, no, I'm going to write this book review and say this is why we have to understand some of the inner machinations of the mind. And really, that book review is one of the things that kicked off the cognitive revolution and us understanding cognition. And in a sense, if you were to sit there and look at B.F. Skinner, you would say, this guy needs to shut up. This is nonsense. Stop, stop, stop. His absurd ideas actually led to progress in science. And by shutting him out, we would have just been completely, I guess, stuck on the behaviorist path, I think, in a sense.
Yeah. Well, so behaviorism actually was quite dominant for a period of time and sort of became its own dogmatism itself.
Mm-hmm,
I would agree with you there that there's sort of a digestive process that takes place where you kind of have to move through these ideas as phases to sort of come out the other end, and everybody kind of needs to sort through them themselves, have those debates, have those conversations, and eventually kind of move into the next paradigm, right? The next paradigm of thinking.
mm-hmm.
So I wanted to jump right there from going from B.F. Skinner, who's no, if you guys know Skinner boxes, there's some infamous work he's done there as well. Um, and get right into Rupert Sheldrake and his critiques of materialism. So he says that,
Mm-hmm.
and this is in the book Science Set Free, which I read about a month ago and got through, and actually was very illuminating to me. That book actually is very similar, in my opinion, to something called the Fourth Political Theory, which was proposed by Alexander Dugin. I was watching a lecture or well, actually not a lecture, an interview with Alexander Dugin that was recently posted by my friend Michael Millerman. Michael Millerman translated some of Dugin's work, and though Dugin is very, very controversial in the West, I'm not going to get into his thoughts right now. But one of the things that Millerman says about Dugin, or that Dugin says about himself, that Millerman has repeated, is that when people come to discover Dugin's fourth political theory, there are sort of two general reactions to it. One is that people are totally appalled and disgusted, and they just reject it with as strong of an emphasis as possible. They just want to get rid of it. They want to say that it's that it's fascism, even though it outright claims not to be neither fascist nor communist, but it is anti-liberal. And and the other sort of stereotypical reaction to encountering his idea for the first time is that people want to open a bottle of champagne and they want to celebrate because finally somebody has sort of broken free in their minds the shackles of which they were held to, which at least in the realm of the core tenet or of the core debate, I guess, in late 20th century and early 21st century political theory would be that there's really no choice in terms of regimes on a large scale anymore besides communism, fascism, and liberalism. And so Dugin is sort of trying to stake out this sort of fourth position, not a third positionist, very important not to use that term. And I feel as if when I discovered Rupert Sheldrake's work, that I had the same kind of reaction. I wanted to open up a bottle of champagne because it was like, wow, I thought the sciences were dull and boring and weren't making a lot of progress. I think part of the reason why I never even attempted to go into the scientific enterprise myself was because as I grew up, I found that science seemed to be this dull, boring process and they weren't asking really interesting questions. And so I moved more towards philosophy, where I felt like I could be more free to ask those important questions. But when I discovered Rupert Sheldrake, I had that very same reaction, which was like, wow, this guy has suddenly opened up a whole new world of inquiry that I thought was sort of closed off eternally to us and that we had sort of
Mm-hmm.
done away with. In particular, he says that there are sort of 10 tenets of the scientific worldview which make up the ideology of materialism. Now, we're not going to probably work through all of these tenets here today because that would take many, many hours of conversation. And by the way, I don't think either of us are qualified to do so, at least with only each other to count on. That being said, I want to just go over the list real quick so that everybody is clear as to what Rupert Sheldrake's criticisms of the ideology of materialism, what he's calling the ideology of materialism, are, and then we can start moving forward from there. So, number one, everything is essentially mechanical. This is the belief that basically everything that we know about the world can be reduced down into very clear mechanistic processes. This goes all the way back to Descartes when we're thinking about the origins of such an idea. Number two, all matter is unconscious. Number three, the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, excepting for the Big Bang. Okay, so this is thermodynamics, and we have the Big Bang here as the sort of exception. You know, if you get the turtles all the way down question going, it always ends back at the Big Bang. Well, what happened before that? Well, there was some big explosion and everything came into being all at once, including all of the matter and energy. It's not really an answer. It's more like a non-answer. Number 4, the laws of nature are fixed. That is, they
Mm.
are stable and they unchanging over all time. Now, again, there's people who are getting up in their seats right now and ready to turn this podcast off. We're not going to be dealing with all of these questions today, but I just wanted to, again, outline his criticisms of what he calls the materialist ideology and give you some food for thought about whether or not these are assumptions that we should just take on their face and whether or not they have, in fact, been proven by science. I know a number of people who call themselves, empirical, scientifically minded materialists, and yet they don't seem to have, in many cases, the thought through many of these questions, or even really, in some cases, have the training to even assess them properly. Number 5, nature is purposeless. That is, evolution has no goal or direction, no telos. We are going to be getting into that one today. Albeit, number 6, all biological inheritance is material. That is, it is carried in the DNA and other material structures. That one we might also be touching on as well. Minds are number 7. Minds are inside heads and nothing but the activities of brains. Okay, so we have the hard problem of consciousness that's been as yet unresolved for centuries now. And one of the things that we know for sure is that we're conscious. We don't know necessarily about a lot of other things, but we know that we have minds. And so one of the assumptions here, one of the core assumptions, according to Rupert Sheldrake and his ideology of materialism, is that minds are inside heads and nothing but the activities of brains. That is, they are reducible again to those physical interactions inside of the brain. Number 8, memories are stored as material traces and in brains and are wiped out at death. Okay, so that's another thing that's been a real big problem, not only in cognitive science, but also in aspects of computer science. We haven't been able to really figure out where are memories stored. Are they sort of made up of the networks between neurons? Are they localized in a certain portion of the brain? Does it happen because certain parts of the brain are communicating with one another? We haven't actually gotten as clear on that as you might think. Number 9, unexplained phenomena, i.e., telepathy, are illusory. This is one that I'm very excited to get into, although I have some reservations about whether or not we should, whether or not it might be prudent to do so. But that's number 9. Number 10, mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. Now,
Mm.
this one, I actually don't know why he included this as the 10th assumption, particularly just because it's so specific about medicine here. And this one is very, very dangerous, I would say, if it's taken the wrong way. Of course, right now there has been a rise in popularity in alternative methods of healing, alternative methods of knowing, alternative methods of various kinds of woo-woo type theories about medicine. And of course, while we're in the middle of this pandemic, that's been a huge question for all of us. Is the soundness of our medicine and issues around quackery in medicine and homeopathy and other things like that. But he's putting that as his number 10 assumption. So, given those 10 assumptions, those are what Rupert Sheldrake uh, posits as the 10 tenets of the scientific worldview that make up the ideology of materialism. I know I just gave you a lot to process there, Cody. I want to just start with that. What do you think of that list?
I mean, it's really interesting. Kind of what you said is that most people don't consider what's on the list, is what's critical there. Um, you know, Probably when he wrote that list, and I have to imagine it was, you can see like parts of his thinking from, he has this idea of morphic resonance,
Yes, we're going to get
that
into that.
okay, yeah, that there's like a physical inheritance that is non-biological, non-environmental. It is physics-based in a sense. You can see a lot of like the attitudes in that. I think the medicine one is really interesting, because while that one might be rather controversial, it's easily his most falsifiable one. It's one that we already know is pretty much patently true. Um, we know, for example, about cultural illnesses that don't exist in other cultures, about how people really can have spells cast on them by other tribes, and they can only be cured by a shaman, something in which you go into these tribes and you try and come up with a mechanistic explanation. You know, you give them malaria pills or you give them some kind of medicine. It doesn't work, and you really do have to appeal to these kind of cultural forms of healing to deal with them.
Do you
Yeah,
sorry, do you have a specific example of that? And then I have a follow-up question to that as well, just to sketch it out a little bit more clearly.
yeah. I don't have a specific example. This is something that's documented in medical anthropology quite frequently,
Mm-hmm.
about people getting ill because of spells or because they simply believe they have spells. Um, there are all kinds of different factors leading to someone whether or not they're going to get better from an illness or disease. One of which is the idea that they know that there's a cure. That, for instance, is something enough for many scenarios for someone's, immune system bolstered up, to feel better, to do better. Um, and it works in all kinds of cultural cases in which the disease is not apparent. It's a cultural disease. In a sense, it's almost magic. It's not literally magic, but it is in their cultural system magic, and it's working in that way. And it has to have these kind of culture-specific cures. Yeah, I don't have a specific citation for that, but it's quite common.
Well, so I think the most obvious objection here would be that this is some sort of psychosomatism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now, the fact that it could be psychosomatic doesn't actually negate necessarily the claim that these things are, let's say, extra mechanistic. It
Mm-hmm.
just simply means that there's something going on in the brain that's related to their physiological health that we don't quite understand. And of
Mm-hmm.
course, there is also the phenomena of society or cultural wide contagion. That is, certain diseases that pop up that don't have any real physical basis as far as we understand it, but are sort of appear as kind of miasmas as a result of certain cultural conditioning or thinking that's attendant to that age. That as well, I think, would fall under this category of sort of a kind of medicine that is not quite mechanistic, or at least not able to be understood in those terms.
Yeah.
Um, so I wanted to then from I'm not going to get into the laws of nature and whether or not those are fixed, because I don't think either of us are qualified to quite talk on those. But I wanted to specifically zero in on this question of evolution and whether or not it is goal directed and has any kind of telos.
Mm-hmm.
So the claim in tenet number 5 is that nature is purposeless, that evolution has no goal or direction. And if you go back to the early debates around the time when evolutionary theory was being formulated and the ideas of evolution were being introduced, obviously by Darwin as well as others, there is a school of thought that has been sort of relegated to the ruins of history called Lamarckianism, which is very closely related to this idea as well. Uh, do you believe that evolution is without purpose, that it has no telos, or or contrary to that, do you think that there is a reason at least to question that assumption?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just grab something real quick. Um, it's pretty funny. This is one. So Sheldrake appeared in a documentary series that's like 18 hours long or something ridiculous. And it included Rupert Sheldrake, Oliver Sacks, the neurophysiologist or psychiatrist, Daniel Dennett, Freeman Dyson, Stephen Toulmoon, who's a philosopher, and Stephen Jay Gould, who is very noted for being anti-teleological when it comes to the evolutionary process. And this idea of teleology is that evolution has some kind of goal towards the end. where do I stand on that? I mean, I wouldn't say I'm really a teleologist, but I do know people who do have kind of teleological lines of thought in which they say, well, evolution in a sense is um, trying to preserve against entropy or trying to make more productive use of the energy around it. And in that case, you might assume that um, this process of replication through environments is goal directed. Um, One thing that's interesting, and this is what Stephen Jay Gould, who is a biologist and paleontologist who died in the early 2000s, often brought up, was this idea that if you were to just like go back in time, restart evolution's clock, and play it again, would you get to the same point we are now? Would you get to human beings, effectively apes standing on two legs, talking on podcasts, if you were just to play it all out? It's a pretty interesting question. Um, I don't think we would, but it'd be interesting to see if there was a way. I mean, we do know of places in which organisms have essentially evolved um, certain traits and environments that organisms before them had in those same environments, and that's that kind of feature fit that natural selection provides. That natural selection essentially filters an organism or a population through an environment, fits it so that it maximizes its fitness in those environments. And oftentimes, what you see is that certain traits arise independently um, in different lineages to do the exact same things. And in that sense, you might say, actually, no, evolution is teleological.
Hmm. Well, so I had Will Buckner on a while back, known as Evolving Moloch on Twitter. He himself is also an anthropologist. And one of the things that I got out of his conversation was that I really understood from talking to him one of the ways of thinking about human beings within anthropology, which is that they're largely shaped by their ecological niches and sort of the incentives and resources and affordances that are available in the environments in which they evolved. Now, this perspective, I would say, based on what you just said there with regard to whether or not evolution has a telos, would say then that no, it doesn't. That sort of how organisms come to be or how they evolve is almost incidental to the niches in which they inhabited and the other organisms that are surrounding them that they're competing with, as well as the various kinds of natural resources and weather conditions, whatever factors you want to include in that. Um, that sort of give rise to the incentives and the various competitive dynamics that they're exposed to. And then those result in various kinds of selection, whether it's through just outright natural selection or more advanced sexual selection, whatever it may be, that's driving it. That perspective is almost reducing the mechanism of evolution down to pure physical processes,
Mm-hmm.
something like what Sheldrake here is an opposition to. And with regard to whether or not evolution has a telos, so one of the sort of criticisms, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to quite articulate this as well as others may have in the past. One of the criticisms of evolutionary theory is that fitness itself as as a function is not very well defined, and that it can seem as if it's somewhat circular. In that, what do we say organisms are doing? Well, they're trying to survive and reproduce, and that's what makes them fit. It's like, well, what is fitness? Well, fitness is survival and reproduction. So it sort of just goes back on itself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and what you would get out of that is you would say, well, then all of the evolutionary variation that exists is really just a result of kind of random accidents, right? Random mutations, random decisions, random occurrences that, cut off one evolutionary line and gave preference to another somewhere way, way, way back. And then we're just sort of dealing with the result of these sort of branching off that goes all the way back, infinitely back to the origins of life. Um, and so all this complexity that we see is not necessarily the result of evolution itself moving in a particular direction, but actually is just sort of something that comes out of everything. Now, of course, you also mentioned there that you run into this problem of complexity. Well, how are you getting this what appears to be an increase in complexity of life, when what we know thermodynamically speaking is that the world is moving towards entropy? So how are we getting to use the phrases of Jordan Peterson, how are we getting all this order that's supposedly coming out of a system that is on a macro scale moving into more chaos? Do you find that line of questioning convincing with regard to those who are more biased towards wanting to ascribe perhaps a teleological view of evolution?
Yeah, no, this is a discussion I love. Stephen Jay Gould wrote a book called Full House, where he tried to approach that question similarly, where he said, even if evolution doesn't have a telos, it kind of certainly appears that way, right? Like over evolutionary time, things didn't just stay as single-celled organisms. You and I clearly aren't bacteria, unless there's some superior being looking at us right now saying we are clearly bacteria. Um, but we're not bacteria, clearly. And Gould's answer, which I find almost sufficient, is this idea of the drunkard's walk, which is that a drunk stumbling home from the bar one night, and on his left side he has a wall. Well, as he's stumbling, he's just randomly walking around. He's not necessarily walking in a straight line or towards a specific goal, but every once in a while he bumps into that wall and then he walks right. The important thing to realize is that to the left he has a wall. He can't go down, he can only go up in complexity. And over time, if you just measure his variation as he's walking, he's going to go right a lot further than he goes left, simply because of that wall. Now, what's interesting about that, or not sufficiently answered in that, is why is it that things don't just shrink all the way back down to bacteria periodically? We've had mass extinctions that have been pretty bad in the planet's past. For example, when we had like a huge oxygenation event in Earth's history, and it just like killed off like 98% of life on Earth. Most of it was single-celled, but that did happen. Why is it that we don't continuously get knocked back all the time? Why isn't that humans aren't just continuously returning to monkey? Well, kind of the answer there, I think, is this idea of entrenchment. That if you just think about this idea of the drunkard's walk, I would say, that's only partially right, which is that every once in a while, the drunkard is walking on a path, but then he falls down. And the idea here is that now he's on another tier where he can't go left from that position. So essentially, he's on another drunkard's walk, but this time on another tier, and he can't go back all the way. And I think that's almost a sufficient answer to this question of why things appear teleological. Mm-hmm. That there is a ratcheting effect.
Okay. Well, that's actually very interesting from a computer science perspective, because it's very close to what you would call a random walk in terms of the search space, and you can actually view evolution as an algorithm that is as a search algorithm, just more plainly. Actually, I had a conversation with Jim Rutt the other day, and he said he gave me a really good nugget of insight, which I kind of already knew, but it was good to be reminded of it, which is that every business is at its core a kind of search algorithm. And the offshoot of that, one offshoot of that, is that there's no way of knowing which search algorithm is optimal.
Yes.
This is called the free lunch theorem. And so if you think of evolution as a search algorithm, I think then it starts to sound a little bit more teleological, because then you have to ask the question, well, what is it searching for? Now, I said at the beginning of this well, actually, I think before we started this conversation off camera, that my friend, not my friend, but our, I would say an email acquaintance, Donald Hoffman, has an interesting theory of perception that involves evolutionary simulations, evolutionary games that are simulated, and the core, I guess, offshoot or thing that he gets out of that is that if you take organisms and you put them into an evolutionary simulation using evolutionary algorithms, what you'll find is that the organisms that tend to succeed, and if you play this iteration over millions and millions of times, so that the probability uh, goes to one. Um, what you find is that the organisms that are most optimized for noticing fitness payoffs will always succeed over the organisms that are looking for truth, that is trying to understand the actual conditions of their
Mm,
environment.
okay.
Now, him and I are going to have a conversation, hopefully at some point soon, that's going to get more clear on his ideas. He sent me a number of his papers, which I have been reviewing. And so I don't have an entirely clear grasp on the full implications of what he's saying quite yet. But it's very interesting because if you think of evolutionary in those terms, then what's happening is that you have all of these search algorithms that are then monitoring the landscape for differing fitness payoffs and optimizing for collecting those payoffs.
Hmm.
That is improving their fitness in whatever way that's defined, um, and that has some various implications. I would say for this question of whether or not evolution is entirely purposeless. One of the things that you might ask then is, well, why would there be this seemingly mathematical a model that is looking for all of these payoffs and is trying to sort of increase its let's say territoriality within space time?
Hmm.
At least that's the dimensions that we know of that we're trapped in. So anyway, that's all a little bit of a side of an aside there, and I don't think we can fully get into all of that today. I want to move on to biological inheritance. This is something that I think you know a bit more about than I do, and ties into this idea of morphic resonance. You mentioned morphic resonance earlier. Morphic resonance, at least from my understanding of Rupert Sheldrake, now I wasn't able to get in direct contact with him. He has whole teams of people that sort of manage him now, so he's a little bit harder to get in touch with these days. But morphic resonance, from as far as I understand it, and this is my layman's understanding, you can correct me or you can explain it yourself a little bit more in depth if you find that my definition is insufficient. Morphic resonance is the idea that organisms which which are structurally similar to other organisms have an effect on them that is time invariant. That is, things that existed in the past that are similar to things that exist in the future. There is a sort of connection uh, outside of linear time, and also not localized by geography, for
Hmm.
example, uh, by by nature, or due to the fact that they are morphologically similar. Uh, and Rupert Sheldrake even goes so far as to claim that something like our twin studies, which are sort of the golden standard for for various kinds of scientific comparisons in trials, are sort of the classic example of identical twins that were separated at birth, right? Are sort of the ideal thing. If you could find those and you can study them on a number of dimensions, then you get a great comparison because they're supposedly, they're genetically as close as you're going to get to identical, and therefore you can work out questions of, let's say, nature versus nurture. I'm very interested in this question myself, just because I happen to be an identical twin, and so I know from observing my own life and that of my identical twin that there are certain uncanny similarities between us, as well as unexplainable differences in how we came to develop. And now, of course, we didn't live the exact same life. We are also influenced by the presence of each other. We were not raised in independent environments. Um, that being said, if Sheldrake's claim of morphic resonance has more to do with morphological similarity than it does necessarily even to let's say genetic encoding, um, then that has all kinds of implications for even this gold standard in science that we have of comparison among twin studies. Uh, what do you think of this idea of morphic resonance? It does not get a lot of, I will say, it does not get a lot of play in the scientific community. It's generally rejected as a theory, and unfortunately, I have not been able to find a lot of solid explanations of morphic resonance besides what's on Rupert's website and many, many, many talks that
Mm-hmm.
he's given publicly where he explains it. But I was looking for something a little bit more rigorous, which I've yet to discover. Maybe you know of something. What do you think of morphic resonance?
Yeah, so the book you'll want is called Presence of the Past, and that was kind of his big expose on what morphic resonance is. And it's pretty much as you described it. It's that there is not just biological fit, there's also physical fit in the world. Um, his theory runs into a problem and he probably doesn't see this as a problem in that you don't get the mechanistic explanation of it, and usually what he says is that it's something quantum. But the example that he always gives um, is testing lab rats. And so he says, okay, well, it's interesting that when you take an experiment on lab rats, some kind of behavioral experiment, we were just talking about B.F. Skinner, who famously experimented on rats, says that the first time you try the experiment, the rats are going to be pretty slow. But the second time you try it, they're going to be pretty fast. But he's not talking about rats in the same lab. He's talking about rats in different labs in different countries. His idea
Mm-hmm.
here is that you can do an experiment for the first time in rats in America over and over, and you can train these rats to excel at this, different thing. And then you train rats in Australia, and suddenly you get a result that they do quicker. There's all kinds of reasons that could be. I don't know if this is actually verified. It could just be that people understand the experiments a little bit more. Um, it could be that measurements change. But it is an interesting question. The reason why Sheldrake came up with these things is because he studies plants, and specifically the development of plants. Why do plants get certain shapes? Um, Botany is like, in many senses, going through or has been in this kind of esoteric revolution in which people are now saying, oh, plants have behavior, plants have cognition, plants almost have an understanding. Yeah, yeah, cognition. Um, where people have been asking these questions, and um, Sheldrake was really on the forefront of pushing all these ideas about plants. But he later came to say, okay, like let's start talking about why do different organisms have the same structural features over time? Why do we get convergent evolution in biological systems? As we were talking about earlier, natural selection, often brings in this like form fit function, even for different lineages. But Rupert Sheldrake is saying that's not because of biological inheritance or because of the physical environment. That's because of something else, something having to do with just like the mechanics of shape and a almost not when I say physical, I mean physics based inheritance that they have.
Hmm. Well, so in particular, he refers to it as a field
Mm-hmm.
theory. So he's talking about often magnetic fields, which are supposedly what's influencing, in particular, this aspect
Mm-hmm.
of form, right? So, how does a leaf know, for example, based on its DNA inheritance, which is sort of a set of infinite information instructions for coding proteins, what form that leaf will take, right? And of course, even among even within the same plant, all of the leaves that arise on it are going to be slightly different. There's going to be variation among the leaves, um, and so this question of like, I guess one of the core one of the core um, I don't want to say paradoxes. One of the core puzzles that's that Rupert Sheldrake is pointing to when he's talking about this idea of morphic resonance is that we don't understand from what we know about DNA, how exactly organisms come to be formed in the way that they are, simply given the instructions. Now, you can say that there is a sort of a compression function that's happening on the level of DNA, and so what you're actually getting is you're actually getting information that's being compressed down to sort of minimum viable amounts, and then what you have on the physical plane in terms of an organism that grows out of nothing and becomes something, or actually out of a previous organism, but in terms of an organism that comes to be based on the recombination of DNA that gave life to it. In the case of humans, uh, what you have is then a sort of projection happening, right? So you have a projection from one dimension into another, and so you can actually have that that's, let's say, a three-dimensional projection that's actually represented with full fidelity in two dimensions. And so that's one idea that sort of explains away this unresolved question. How do you think about that? I mean, is it is that a problem on just a pure informational level that we haven't really dealt with? In this book, I do want to say, at least in the book Science Set Free, all of these tenets that I've listed here that are sort of the basis for us working through this conversation of Rupert Sheldrake, what he does primarily is he takes the core tenets and he rephrases them as
Mm-hmm.
questions. So, is it true that X, or why is it that X? Do we know that X? And so, rephrasing them as questions is really more of the uh, of the attitude, of the orientation that we're having towards these ideas, rather than making outright claims that they are or are not true. Um, so I don't know if I totally erased the question there in that explanation there, but I did want to stay on morphic resonance for a second here, and ask you a little bit about his idea that it's related somehow to
Mm-hmm.
electromagnetic fields.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. So there was actually um, what Sheldrake is proposing is actually somewhat of an older idea. Um, his part of it is really in proposing this mechanism. If you go back to like the 1910s, there was a biologist, or maybe he's a paleontologist, named Darcy Thompson, and he wrote a book called On Growth and Form. And famously, he
Hmm.
made the argument that all fish are the same shape. An eel is just a fish where you've taken it along this axis and just stretched it out. A sunfish is one where you've just squeezed it. A shark, you just take a few points and raise it up. But essentially, you can get the exact same fish out of every single shape. Unfortunately, Darcy Thompson didn't really understand at the time um, Darwinian inheritance, because this was before the modern synthesis had happened, when genetics and evolution came together. And so Darcy Thompson said that, well, I think it's something physical, that there are mathematical principles leading to why fish are just basically the same shape, and it necessarily doesn't have anything to do with inheritance. Sheldrake's idea about magnetic fields is interesting. He had There's this clip of him where he's talking about how pigeons get home, how passenger pigeons know how to get. You've seen this, where he basically says, during World War II, all these pigeons would be dropped out of bomber planes that were crashing, and sent to go home with a letter saying, "Hey, we crashed around these coordinates. Please save us." And Sheldrake basically goes through all the mechanisms that had been proposed for how it is that these birds were able to get home, back to the British Isles, from the middle of the ocean or from Germany. And he says, okay, what are the reasons? And so he says, maybe was it the magnetic field? Um, Maybe is it, they're using astral navigation or something like that. And he goes through and talks about how all of these ideas had been, discredited. Like he says, okay, people ended up, like blinding these birds and putting them in like spinny cages so that they had no orientation of where they were. If they had some kind of internal gyroscope sending them home, it would be thrown out of whack. He said, we can put basically electrical knobs on their heads so that it screws up the EM field and they can't get back. Um, and the reason I bring this up is because I think one thing about Sheldrake's proposal is that it almost is a little bit more similar to Darcy Thompson in that, yeah, he does talk about maybe it's magnetic or maybe it's electrical. Sometimes he says, oh, maybe it's quantum. Um, I'm not quite sure that he's certain what it is either.
Okay. Well, then we'll leave it at that, I guess. Um, so uh, there there's more than just Rupert Sheldrake's sort of pet theory of morphic resonance. Some of these criticisms that he has of the materialist worldview are um, are a
Mm-hmm.
lot more general, right? A lot more general, and of course, what we really want to talk about is what are the assumptions that are built into our conceptions of science that are sort of getting in the way of the progress of science. He's very careful to note that he's not anti-science in any sense of the word, and in fact, what he wants to do is he
Mm-hmm.
wants to improve science by forcing it to address these criticisms. Um, One of them is, of course, this idea that unexplained phenomena, that is anything that we don't have a testable way of verifying or negating, uh, is something that we should just throw away and preclude to the realm of hokiness or mysticism or something that's
Mm-hmm.
outside of the purview of science altogether, and therefore also under our sort of materialist paradigm that we're in right now, therefore also garbage more or less, by as far as many people would consider it. And the one thing that he brings up that sort of gets everybody, in a rut is this idea of telepathy. Now, there are other things that he talks about as well, like remote viewing, or even the phenomenon of people sensing that other people are looking at them when their back is turned. This is a very common experience that almost everybody has reported feeling, at least subjectively. Now he claims that there are experiments that he has carried out and that others have carried out that show that in fact there is something to it, and these aren't just intuitions that we have. Or that we know about from watching too many sci-fi movies or something like that. What do you think about his claims of not treating unexplained or unexplainable phenomena as illusory? I think that's an interesting way that he phrases it there because, contrary to that, he has actually gone through and tried to conduct small scale experiments to show that they're not illusory. So how do you think about, these sort of these claims around various kinds of, I guess, subjective experiences that many people have, or that most people have in some cases, that the scientific
Mm-hmm.
establishment, let's say, tends to just reject outright as sort of paranormal thinking or parapsychology, things along
Yeah,
those
it's a great
lines.
question. It's pretty funny the telepathy thing. I don't really believe in it, but a lot of people have. You look at, like, for example, Alan Turing, and when he was coming up with the Turing test,
Hmm.
he said, this is the reason why we can say computers are eventually going to be conscious. He had about like 9 or 10 critiques that he had to address from all these people who said, no, this is why computers will never be conscious. The only one he actually took seriously was this idea of telepathy. Like, someone said to him, yeah, but like, what about like people can mind read and computers can't? And he was like, ah, damn, you got me there. I don't know how we're going to get computers to get there.
That's great. That's a great little
Yeah,
bit of
yeah.
trivia.
My thought towards these things personally, on a personal level, is put a pin in it. If you think something's weird, to me, that's reason enough to start asking questions about it. Say, okay, why do we have this thing? Um, why do humans tend to feel that way? Uh, you know, when proposing a mechanism, obviously you have to be able to uh, tack it down to something. This goes back to this issue of the mechanistic process that we talked about Sheldrake, and this is something I kind of disagree with him on. It isn't necessarily that there are things that don't have a mechanism. Um, the problem is that if you don't have a mechanism, you can't really describe what it is that you're even talking about. In many cases, you have this kind of vague view of, well, we know someone's looking at us, and that's like a thing, and it's like, okay, but like, what is that? Like, when you get down to it, what is it, other than an intuition? And if you're going to be able to describe what something even is, you have to be able to break it down into its parts. But the point is, isn't that necessarily that these ideas about telepathy or farsight or anything like that are true. It's that the question needs to remain open. It's that we have had many questions about the world in the past that maybe we weren't able to address before. And it was a very unfortunate
Yes.
thing because we didn't have the necessary tools. We didn't take things seriously on like a cultural standpoint. The idea is to kind of let any question in, but when it comes to explanations, put a pin in it. And unfortunately, oftentimes that's not how science works. And one thing is that there really isn't that much support for looking for things that don't already have an established mechanism of sorts. Um, I can't imagine without Darwin, tacking it down in this like massive, thick volume where he just like broke down every single farm animal and said, we know why they got like long hooves or long udders or whatever. That's the same thing that happens in biological systems. I can't imagine that, a scientific institution would just start spending money on something like that without the mechanism already being there. But it was something that was true. Um, there is support, of course, from private institutions. Things like the Templeton Foundation gives money to very serious scientists studying like human evolution, studying things like physics. Obviously, that's a big Templeton grant. But every once in a while, at their stakeholder conferences, they do have these kind of parascience groups that show up that they are also giving money to. And the fact that it is coming from like a private institution, I think I'm fine with that. Again, the point is not necessarily to count every explanation, but not to discount every question. And I think that's kind of the valuable thing. But unfortunately, we don't have that culture in science, from my view at least.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Actually, I think at this point we're getting close to the point where there's enough like just sort of free range billionaires in the world that if they really wanted to investigate these questions, well, like I don't know, go try to get some funding from some of these guys. There's a bunch of tech people, not just in the
Mm-hmm.
U.S. but all over the world, who have excess capital, and they're investing in all kinds of wacky startups that are inevitably going to fail. Why not invest in some wacky scientific endeavors? One of the things that I think we should keep in mind, though, is that people want a
Yep.
return on their investment. And so if we're going to argue that these projects need funding, there has to be some way of knowing whether or not you're just
Yep.
frankly scamming them, and looking for a check without actually providing anything of value. And that's very hard to do, especially when you start talking about wanting to get out of um, these conditions of rigor that are normally attached to explaining different phenomena and wanting and having a mechanistic basis for providing them. It's very hard to discern whether you're just
Mm-hmm.
throwing money into a pit and hoping that that some whack job hasn't just tricked you into giving them a nice $500,000 grant or something like that to go study whatever. Now there is lots of waste that goes into other kinds of things, particularly various kinds of nonprofit work
Mm-hmm.
and activist work. I would say that is largely a scam, and they succeed at luring in all kinds of wealthy people into giving them funding for their efforts that are dubious at best. Um, so, with that being said, I don't think giving a little bit of money to some of these outside thinkers, even some who maybe aren't necessarily working within the traditional uh, halls of the academy, to do some funding, provided, or to do some research, provided that they actually are serious thinkers and that they are seriously pursuing these goals, and that they're going to uh, at least conduct reporting, uh, and share their results in a way that's publicly available, to see whether or not something might come of these. I don't know how much money Rupert Sheldrake has accumulated by now in his later years, but I'm assuming that he's got funding sources coming in from lots of different places. And one of the things that I've been curious when researching him, and again, I don't mean to disparage him at all, is just why hasn't he been able, with all of his credentials, with all of his writings and public appearances, why is he claiming that these ideas are not getting, are simply lacking the funding to be tested out, when it seems to me as if, you know the people that might be interested in this, that might have the funds, the resources available to pursue different research endeavors on it,
Hmm.
are probably aware of him, if not in direct contact with him, uh, and so that begs the question whether he really has something going on here, and the biases are just so strong, and so and the sort of the anti Sheldrakean propaganda is just so thoroughly entrenched in us that no one's willing to take the risk, or whether or not there is, I don't want to say fraud, but whether or not there is something missing that he hasn't been able to sort of provide as a justification for maybe getting the kind of projects off the ground and the kind of funding that he would like for these kinds of things. One of the things that I'm looking forward to is hopefully the rise of a I'd say a more traditional, um, practice of science. Scientists historically were very similar to philosophers in that if they really wanted money, if they really wanted freedom and the ability to pursue their intellectual pursuits without a lot of constraints, by be it government authorities or research institutions or whatever. Traditionally, what they would do is they would find a patron. They would find someone. Often, this was a member of the aristocracy who was sympathetic to their ideas and was willing to basically fund them, in
Hmm.
order to just sort of go work on them, and not be bothered by these sort of financial constraints. I think that one of the things that a lot of people are now starting to talk about once again, now that we have so many people who are independently wealthy, who weren't before, um, is getting better mechanisms like that. And I, for one, would be very, very interested in doing that, not only in the sciences, but also in philosophy as well. I think there are a number of philosophers, number of philosophical schools that are not being treated very well by the universities as it stands. And basically, if you're not functioning within that system, I'll just speak for philosophy right now. Um, you're kind of on your own. You got to like publish some books, or have a YouTube channel, or hope that you can sort of
Hmm.
make a living some other way. As far as I know, there aren't a lot of people who have the resources available to sort of fund these guys. Um, and I would like to foster, if we could, in the near future, more of a culture of sort of noblesse oblige, where the people who have managed to make significant fortunes for themselves, whether that's through tech or elsewhere, um, start to actually take
Hmm.
these outsiders a little bit more seriously and start to actually fund these projects that they're interested in, so that there isn't so much reliance on these sort of more homogeneously minded university structures.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. And you and I have talked about this idea of patronage before, with respect to the Enlightenment. That Walter Scheidel, in his book *Escape from Rome*, hypothesized that really two of the reasons why the Enlightenment happened was because patronage allowed people to leave the traditional institutions, um, and two, this Republic of Letters allowed these people with different patrons to communicate their ideas with each other. I think two things are really important here. One is this idea of open science, open access, pre-registration, preprints, all of these things. For a long time, science, again, has taken place in the university institution. Um, as of late, it's kind of becoming obvious that scientists haven't been the best scientists. Capital S scientists haven't been the best scientists. We know about the failure to replicate. We know about people hiding their data. We know about people just straight up forging data. And so, in like the last decade or so, and I'll say it's the last decade, um, we've developed this toolkit to make science more honest. With that, though, I think that scientists kind of have to come to the exception that, or to the to come to accept that this toolkit means that this toolkit can be used outside of scientific institutions as well. That if you are pre-registering things, if you're being honest, if you're recording your data correctly, if it can be checked in the same way, uh, then you can say, okay, they're acting as scientists as we are. One thing that you bring up, this that you have a patron, people will say all the time, well, this is you. This brings in a problem where you can be influenced by the person who's paying you. That someone will say, okay, I want you to research cigarettes, and my last name's Marlboro, but just completely ignore that fact. Um, you know, and I'm almost fine with saying that might happen. Because in science, we still have this kind of obligation to those around us, that we have colleagues who we won't criticize, that we know people who we know if we say certain things, they'll get angry, or we know that the NSF really won't like this grant if we word it in this way, and we better not, do this instead of this. I think that already happens in science in a sense, that we have this kind of culture of obligation to those around us, rather than to maybe the experiments that we're actually wanting to work on. So maybe with open access and all that, and I've kind of argued in the past that maybe this kind of open access movement will end up like killing science within universities. We'll get something new, and it's interesting to note just how few PhD positions there are and how many PhDs are being granted. That there is plenty of talent out there. It doesn't mean that those who are getting jobs are necessarily the best, although I congratulate everyone who did get a job. The thing is that there are many people with talent out there who still want to continue to do this kind of research, and maybe there will be places for them in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what we're doing here. Obviously, if you're doing a podcast, it's a very small
Mm-hmm.
type of intellectual exploration. But ideally, I imagine even just in my own work, being able over the next few decades to build out larger institutions uh, as my networks grow, as my networks get stronger, as people that I'm around gain more positions of status and authority and also resources just in general. I think that one of the things that the internet is actually providing is for the first time in human history, all of these people who were once separated by various barriers can actually start talking to one another. And there's
Mm-hmm.
no way that I would be talking to you, most likely, if we hadn't met over the internet. And so now we've had several conversations, and I assume that we're going to have more in the future. And that's a result of this new ability to communicate with each other. And so, if you can talk to people, everything that we know of that exists that humans have built was built by other people and ultimately was created by humans talking to one another. So this is where it starts. It starts with conversations like these, which then lead into deeper bonds and deeper plans and eventually all out endeavors and the creation of new institutions. And new
Mm-hmm.
institutions, I believe, are what's going to eventually come out of a lot of this chatter. People like to complain a lot about how, all these people on Twitter are just doing nothing. They're just not doing anything. They're just posting hot takes and selfies and and criticizing journalists. And it's like, well, hold on, like slowly roll a little bit there. One of the most important things that's happening on Twitter is that people are networking. People are meeting other people that have shared interests
Yeah.
that would have never discovered one another prior to the advent of these technologies. Now, I'm not claiming that Twitter is the best forum necessarily for connecting. I'm hoping that there will be various various Twitter-like entities that arise in the future, perhaps some decentralized ones that aren't controlled by Jack, that come up, um, and provide these similar opportunities. But it is at the end of the day up to just individuals, regardless of
Mm-hmm.
whether or not you're in a fancy tenured position inside of a university or you're just some guy with a podcast. It's always going to be individual minds interacting with other individual minds who come together over shared ideas and decide to create new things, and that's how we move forward.
Mm-hmm.
There's no magic bullet. There's no government agency or whatever that is going to sort of move things forward. If anything, the government agencies mostly, in my opinion, hold things back. Now, of course, there have been very important things that are funded by the government. Obviously, most of the internet that we know today came out of a DARPA program. But at the end of the day, even within those institutions, there were individuals who made individual connections across and outside of their uh, their gilded positions, and that's what brought about all the stuff that we have. And so you can thank the engine of capitalism if you like. You can thank government. You can thank the academy. Uh, whatever you're biased towards,
Mm-hmm.
it still just comes down to individual thoughts and individual minds, and those minds coming together. Now, I want to get into this question of materialism. Now, all of these tenets that we've talked about today with regard to Rupert Sheldrake's criticisms are couched in this materialist worldview that we've inherited. And as I said earlier, there is a long history of philosophy of science that goes back that this goes back to, and in particular, I would say the predominance of physics and the power of physics is really what undergirds a lot of the claims of materialist supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say that we are in a materialist supremacy uh, paradigm right now. One of the questions that I have, and I've been struggling to get around this, I don't know if you have a good answer, but maybe I can at least pick your brain on it a little bit, is okay, well, if we're going to start rejecting some of the fundamental tenets of materialism, if we're going to claim that this materialism has sort of uh, has sort of morphed into a kind of ideology that doesn't exactly have, at least in some of its claims, um, uh, a sound scientific basis for positing them as absolutely true in all cases. Uh, what what is there to grasp onto that's outside of that? Because
Mm-hmm.
if we're trying to move outside the materialist paradigm, how do we know that we have solid footing underneath, and that we're not just sort of drifting off into fairyland? We talked earlier about these postmodernists encroaching on everybody and their intersubjectivity. You know, I think there's something to be said about the subjective experience, and I think there's something to be said about, let's say, perspectivism. I don't know if that's the right word here, um, but we also have to have a shared basis for understanding each other and understanding the world, and we have to have something that we know that we can build off of.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see a way out of this materialist paradigm? I know there's often a lot of appeals to, let's say, quantum mechanics in these kind of claims. They'll say, well, uh, we haven't been able to reconcile relativity with quantum mechanics, and so because of that, there's all these weird, spooky action at a distance with quantum entanglement and non-locality and whatnot, superpositions, and therefore we could sort of start to peel away the doctrines
Mm-hmm.
of materialism by an appeal to quantum mechanics. But I sort of view quantum mechanics as just sort of a less understood layer of materialism. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you there that quantum mechanics is just materialism of a different flavor.
Hmm.
And in so many things, it's hard to say what is and what isn't materialist. I would say almost the way out would almost be like a pluralism, but even then, this pluralism, like you said, doesn't allow everyone to get on the same page. Um, my kind of view is that you can kind of take materialism in places where you want it and in places where you don't. Um, so like for example, we can say, okay, materialism might be the right approach to taking science. That yeah, we do have to track down mechanisms. We have to understand how things work. One of the good things about science is that we can say, okay, um, this gives us kind of a knowledge that is grounded in something. But then comes this question: why does any of that have to extend into the political or social realm? Why is it that we have to always be like, this is kind of the smart thing to do or something like that? In a sense that maybe societies don't always have to be guided by science. They can just use it as it comes up for their issues. This is something that Feyerabend talks about in his book. Um, uh, um, God, I already said it. Against Method.
Against Method, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. He talks about this in Against Method, and it's kind of interesting. He praises the Chinese because he says, "Hey, they use science when they want to, but they don't let it just control all of their institutions. They just use it as the need arises." And in a sense, his argument is that um, this materialist worldview, or scientism, generally speaking, is kind of an impediment to human advancement and freedom, that we should have the freedom to make non scientific choices. Um, One place where I think this is really interesting is in separating science from the political process. The problem with science is that it has to be wrong. Um, the way that science advances is by proving a right idea wrong that you previously thought was right before. Well, my
This
God.
is Nassim Taleb's Via Negativa.
Ah, okay. Wait, what is that?
Oh, I'm not sure. Maybe you're not familiar. He talks about the this point here, which is that science proceeds by negation,
Mm-hmm.
not by affirmation.
Yeah, and that's kind of a traditional Popperian view.
Yes.
But what if we're making societal decisions? Um, do we always want the opportunity to be wrong? Maybe this is a case where we just do what works, not necessarily what's right. You were talking about earlier these simulations where you have two different kinds of actors or two kinds of agents, one which tries to know its landscape and one which merely makes it try to work. Um, the one that merely does what works is the one that ends up surviving. The one that which tries to understand the game, um, by trying to understand it, it has to make a lot of mistakes, I would guess, and that ultimately leads to its loss. So, in a sense, yeah, science can advance that way, but maybe human knowledge, or not human knowledge, but human societies shouldn't take that route.
Well, leaving aside the assumption that it's making mistakes, I think the core issue is that if you're is that it's an inefficient use of resources
Mm-hmm.
to try to understand the truth of the landscape that you're in, uh, when when optimizing instead for your fitness payoffs would suffice just as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this interesting question of how much does the truth really matter?
Yeah.
Which again, it harkens back to these postmodernists who are saying that, in some cases that it doesn't matter that much, or that it only matters insofar as it coincides with our power, which would again be a kind of overlapping case where the truth just happens to be the most fit thing that you could do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's actually part of the reason for the rise of the supremacy of the scientific worldview, is that we found that if we have certain logical, scientific, mathematical, let's say physical truths that we can build off of, well, we found that actually that increases our capacity for affecting the world drastically.
Yeah.
We can do way more with a scientific understanding of the world than we could before. And so it's actually the utility of science that is so valuable to us, not necessarily the truth itself.
Yeah, and I agree with that perspective. But as we both know, that's not actually how it plays out. That science and society play back on each other. That
Hmm.
if you hold this worldview, you're being anti-scientific. Sometimes the answer to that is so what. Does it really hurt anyone at the end of the day if my neighbor is a creationist? I don't think so. Um, or, for example, certain.
Well, is there a scientist out there who says that they've totally refuted creationism? I'd like to meet them,
Ah,
Richard.
oh,
Richard
Richard
Dawkins.
Dawkins.
I'm looking at you. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
but
well, really, like, I'm sorry. I, I don't have a strong view
mhm.
on creationism, but what I do find repulsive is that some people like to clothe themselves in the accoutrements of scientific rationalism and then claim that every creationist is just a know-nothing moron or some sort of delusional, backwards thinking person. There's no scientific theory or principle or even law, which now we've even uh, we've even pointed towards maybe there's some mutability to our understanding of scientific laws, or they at least get updated when we find out that they no longer work.
Mhm.
Um, that says that creationism is impossible and that it's precluded from our understanding of anything. And so you're free to have your opinion on that. I don't have a strongly held conviction either way, but I would say that it does strike me as somewhat unscientific to simply dismiss creationists out of hand as unscientific themselves. There are, in fact, many scientists who are also creationists.
Yeah.
Less popular today than it used to be, but it is the
Well,
case.
well, yeah, of course, and of course, there's like different flavors of creationism. There's, you can refute certain forms of it in certain ways, in which, but that happens within scientific institutions. I'm fine with creationist scientists publishing creationist work, so long as it is still subject to the same, critiques that the rest of science is. We shouldn't be blocking out these people. We should be saying, okay, let's bring your ideas to bear, and let's just see how it works out. Do what do what Mitch McConnell did with the Green New Deal, and just bring it onto the Senate floor and see how everyone votes.
Yeah. So, what did they say? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. You can sort of just let things die by exposing them to the light.
Mhm.
That is that is really in the spirit of science and scientific progress. We should let the ideas come out, and if they cannot withstand proper criticism, proper thorough analysis, and rigor, then there's nothing to be afraid of
Mhm.
because they're going to collapse. They're going to collapse on their own internal contradictions, and so. There's no need to necessarily be dogmatic about these things if we actually believe in in the in the truth and the validity and the soundness of our processes. This is actually very similar to arguments about free speech more
Mhm.
generally, right? Which is that if you are actually a proponent of free speech, then you shouldn't be afraid of accepting controversial, even potentially dangerous ideas in the discourse, because if those ideas are wrong, they will collapse. Now, I think there are some caveats to be made there because, of course, there are swindlers and propagandists, and there are various aspects of persuasion. So there are ways of sort of tricking the human
Mhm.
mind into accepting things that are unsound, and that can have ramifications that are, in fact, damaging to not only individuals but also society more broadly. And so we have to be careful there when we say that we should just have like a totally free, the free market of ideas, which I don't like the term. I don't even like the analogy of a free market of ideas. I think it's very antiquated and somewhat anachronistic as well. I view it more as an ecology of
Mhm.
ideas. These ideas are competing for various human minds, and um, so the ideas that survive, again, going back to our evolutionary game theory, aren't necessarily the ideas that are the most
Yeah.
truthful. They may be the ideas that are the most fit.
Mhm.
And so that is also another angle which we could take as far as the argument that we should simply just, why don't we just debate it out, man? Like, if you're afraid to debate me, then it's just because your ideas are worse. There is something to be said about let's say, sophists of various
Yeah, you're
kinds.
right.
The term that everyone likes to use on the internet is
Yeah.
grifters. There are grifters. We have to get rid of this disinformation and all of these grifters. And I'm generally pro free speech to an extreme extent, but I also do understand that not everything is that's popular is necessarily
Hmm.
true, and also the most truthful things are sometimes not going to be the most popular, and so there is an interesting balancing act you have to play
Yeah,
there.
absolutely. No, I agree with that. Yeah, maybe I take back my comment.
Oh, well, you
You
don't have
convinced
to.
me.
We're not
You
having a debate
convinced me.
here. All right, all right, all right. So with that being said, we've been going for quite a while now. I think we're nearing the 2 hour
Nice.
mark, which is fine. I don't know how much more time you have today, uh, and I don't want to unfairly monopolize it. But as long as you're still willing to keep going, I'm willing to keep asking you some more
Sounds great.
questions. Um, so I wanted to get a little bit into the research that you're involved in right now and find out a little bit about where you're at. I think we've given Rupert Sheldrake and his ideas a fair treatment. We've also talked a little bit about science as an institution and the concept of scientism, which for those of you who are, we haven't actually defined scientism, but more or less, scientism is essentially adopting science or using science as a dogma rather than treating it as simply a
Hmm.
method. And so whenever someone is saying the word scientism, what they're usually doing is they're usually accusing someone of dressing up what they're saying or what they believe to be true. It, as science when in fact it's actually there are unverified assumptions undergirding it, and really what they've done is they've actually abandoned or disregarded the fact that science is itself a
Hmm.
continuous and self-correcting
Hmm.
process. So just to be clear on that terms, but I wanted to then move on from Rupert Sheldrake. We've given him plenty of time today, and again, I mentioned all the 10 tenets of his critique of materialism at the beginning of this conversation. Anyone who's interested can go look at those themselves, and also his works, which we've mentioned at least two of his books here today. I want to ask you a little bit about what you're working on. So tell the people.
Yeah, sure. So I started a new PhD program in the fall. I left my old one. Um, that was fun. But so I'm switching into the field of cultural evolution. So the question of how is it that cultures change over time, and what are some of the mechanisms underlying it? And one thing I've become recently interested in is innovation. So you look around us and we have all kinds of nice things. Um, we have our computers, we have our microphones. I have a cell phone. I probably shouldn't. We have washing machines, all kinds of different things. And the question is how did we get that, and how do we get more of it? Um, we know, like right now, science in many ways is going through diminishing marginal returns. So for each dollar spent in science, we're getting less and less out of that dollar in terms of research productivity. So, for example, money that went into heart research 30 years ago prevented, X amount of heart attacks over a certain amount of time. But as we've gone further and further, as we've kind of filled out the idea space, as we've learned more things, maybe as we've gone down certain paths of knowledge to the exclusion of others, kind of like we were talking about with evolution recently, it might be the case that we're losing our productivity in a way. And so I'm wondering, what is it about the way that, say, organizations or groups of people and the ways in which they're organized, which leads to even more innovation?
Hmm. Well, so I have some interesting questions for you there. Actually, that is perhaps not coincidental. Actually, our very first conversation together, which was happened to be the very first show of
Hmm.
this podcast, was exactly about this problem of potentially stagnating innovation. And so I'm glad to hear that that's become your main area of study for the time being. I actually had a conversation as well right after that with Jason Crawford, who himself is focused on this question of why has progress
Mm-hmm.
slowed down. He has this blog called Roots of Progress, where he's sort of assessing innovation more broadly out, not only just in science, but also in things like materials and chemistry and nuclear power and all kinds of things. Um, and they're all asking this very similar question. Eric Weinstein is also very focused on this claim. Now he's more focused on, um, I guess, his two areas of concern are like economics and physics. He says that there's a slowdown in economic productivity and real return, as well as in physics. And I think one of the bases for us having this entire conversation about science and scientism today is that perhaps some of these dogmatic views that we have, that we've sort of inherited and that we're sort of just chugging along with, are limiting, are contributing to this lack of innovation, to this slow growth. One of the claims contrary to that is that, well, no, actually, we it's just that for the last few hundred years, as the scientific revolution has really come into being, we have picked all the low hanging
Mm-hmm.
fruit, and so there's no more low hanging fruit left um, to pick, and therefore we're going to get decreasing marginal returns on our efforts because of the fact that we've picked all the low hanging fruit. Uh, Also related to Eric Weinstein, his boss Peter Thiel says that the opposite is the case. That in fact there. It's only an assumption that the low hanging fruit has been picked, and actually there are more. He would call them secrets to be discovered that people are simply not looking for because we've sort of given up on looking for secrets. How do you think about those claims with regard to the causes of our slowdown in innovation? Do you think that all the low hanging fruit has indeed been picked, or is it that we've simply given up on the idea that anything new and valuable can come about without tremendous amounts of effort?
It's both. Um, you know, Robert Trivers talks about evolutionary theory, and he says, back when I was a graduate student, theory was so simple that you could pretty much solve any evolutionary problem with fractions. And he says, in a sense, we're still at that point in time, which maybe isn't all the way true, but knowing just a little bit of standard math will get you a long way. Um, yeah, I do think it's a case that for what we're on, we have picked a large number of the low hanging fruit, but it's not as if each fruit that you pick, diminishes the number of fruit on the tree. Stuart Kaufman talks about this idea of the adjacent possible, those things that we don't
Yes.
necessarily know about. But it is like once you pick a fruit that is of that space, suddenly you realize, oh, there are other fruits of this type. So, it's that you discover a whole new tree from which then you pick. Usually, when we find new theories, new ideas in science, it spurs off like a whole new field of exploration. This was what Thomas Kuhn talked about when he's talking about paradigms. That one paradigm starts to slow down in its research productivity. Someone, boom, introduces something else, and then all of a sudden there's like a huge flurry of research in that area. Um, it might be the case that over time that has kind of a space of its own, where there's like fewer and fewer points to be established or to be found out. Um, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that our institutions are optimized in any way. So even if we have picked all the low hanging fruit, or even if there, um, isn't that much else out there, I wouldn't say that we're at a point where we're really at the same levels of productivity or at the ideal levels of productivity that could be expected. And there are ways to measure this. You can look at research output as kind of a predictable paradigm of what's to follow next. There's certain like curves like Zipf's law or the Hopf curve or something like that for looking at what we should expect in the future. And it may not be the case that we are as productive as we can be. So I think that you can actually be agnostic to this question while still trying to um, bolster research productivity or just industry productivity as well.
Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with the concept of tainter curves?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, roughly stating, I'm going to try to be as accurate as I can be here. It basically says that you're going to get diminishing returns in terms of the benefits of complexity as the level of complexity
hmm
increases, and so you get this curve that sort of bears out. Is one of the problems you think that our institutions for scientific discovery themselves have become overly complex, overly convoluted, and so there's just a lot of baggage? Is that what you're talking about when you're saying that it's not as efficient in terms of knowledge production as we
Yeah,
used to be?
so essentially, we've scaled up in so many ways, but maybe we haven't scaled up in the right ways. Um, what you're talking about with the tainter curves, I think, is really important as well. This idea that as we've grown these institutions, as we've gotten them larger, we have just added on to the amount of administration that needs to be paid, the amount of what David Graeber would call bullshit that, say, faculty or researchers or students have to put up with, while as previously they didn't have all that to do. And that's certainly a problem. One thing about Tainter's hypothesis, though, was that as you get to this tail end of the curve, where the curve starts going down, what you get by a lot of institutions is what he calls scanning behavior. And that's where they start searching for alternatives. Um, and what happens? What's
Meaning
that?
what? I
Just
said meaning
alternatives to
what?
the system that you're in. And if, let me see if I can
Hmm.
grab the book real quick. So what happens in the tainter curve is you end up like diminishing your returns, um, but oftentimes, and I don't know if viewers are even going to be able to see this, is that you exit the curve and then you go into another one. But the good thing
Mm-hmm.
about going into another one is that all of a sudden you get all your returns back. That every once in a while these institutions have to be busted up to allow new ones to come in. And this is kind of what we were talking about with the monastic system going down, and allowing for the university system to arise. Hopefully, right now there's some scanning behavior going on of people looking at different ideas, um, for spreading knowledge, kind of like what we talked about.
Yeah. So we've talked about ways of exiting sort of the university system. I imagine actually there will probably be some decentralized blockchain technology, maybe some DAOs
Mm-hmm.
that are established to help conduct scientific research and coordinate scientific progress. I can imagine even something like the peer review system as it's currently instantiating being routed around. I do think peer review
Mm-hmm.
itself is important, but I think ultimately, because you have to have your work be intelligible to those who are qualified to interpret it. But the way that it's done now is certainly it's just so outdated. The processes
Yeah,
are just so old. None of this technology that we have now, as far as the internet is concerned, existed when these processes were first instituted in the late 19th and early 20th century. So why they haven't been updated is really just a matter of historical inertia at this point, and resistance by those who are benefiting
absolutely.
from it. So hopefully, all that stuff will start to get innovated around sooner rather than later. I wanted to ask you about another law, which I'm not exactly sure if some of these laws that have been coined are laws in the proper sense, or if they're just sort of colloquially laws, which is Moore's law. Moore's law is obviously a very mathematically precise, uh, and this has to do with sort of the return on on how much information we can fit into a chip, right? As time progresses. And so one of the arguments for why progress has been slowed, again, this is at least the first place where I encountered it was in Peter Thiel's 0 to 1. I tend to reference him a lot these days. I wish I didn't so much, but uh, so be it. Um, it. One of the claims as to why perhaps technological progress has slowed down, and it also ties into economic progress as well, is that this tremendous success of Moore's law, the fact that we're going to get exponential returns on our ability to store information over time, means that that the physical space sort of gets neglected, right? The phrase that Teal uses is that it's become about everything's become about growth in bits rather than growth
Mm.
in atoms, and so there's less investment in sort of the more concretized aspects of particular science and technology, things like chemistry, materials science, etc., because of the fact that those fields are so cost intensive. Whereas if we're just moving electrons around on chips and in doing things on computers, well, that's very, very cheap to do. And we're getting more and more returns every year. And Moore's Law isn't going to reach its limits anytime soon, although at some point we are going to get into some physical limitations that people are working on that already. Um, what do you think about that claim? Do you think that Moore's law is in part to blame as to why there has been so much progress in, say, information technology, perhaps at the expense of other areas of inquiry?
Wow, that's really profound. I'd never heard of that theory before. Um, but you can kind of see how that would work, like in terms of like again talking about tainter curves. It might be the case that yeah we get more returns right now in computer chips than we do in chemistry. But one thing that happens is that um, uh, Tainter hypothesized that oftentimes, as you invest more in complexity, again, you come out of the curve. It's that, oh, wait, nope, we found the solution, and you get a new curve. It may be the case that, yeah, we are neglecting certain things that we should be putting money into. Maybe we are spending on the cheap thing rather than the next thing that will actually break us out of the real problems. I'm very open to that idea. I think that's a great idea.
Hmm. Well, it's not my idea, so I'm not going to take credit for it. But that's at least one of the things that he's concerned about, because even in the realm of the physical economy, tech companies have a different structure than a lot of traditional, let's say, corporations.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, industrial manufacturing requires large amounts of capital investment. It's very capital intensive to build factories. You also need large workforces in order to operate those factories, at least until we get some of this automation going. I hear that Elon Musk is working on some of that. Um, but with tech companies, you can have maybe 1/100th of the size of a staff, and minuscule relative to setting up a manufacturing business, levels of initial investment and cost,
Yeah.
and including scaling. By the way, your scaling also, it does not become exceptionally cost prohibitive either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yet this sort of has a uh, and so the different structure, which I would say is not even in quantity but actually is qualitatively different, means that these tech companies, in terms of their not only what they're innovating on, they're going to mostly be innovating on information technology. They're not really interested in investing in let's say new chemicals. Facebook isn't like interested in buying up chemistry startups like maybe Dow has to do. Um, they want to just build more websites and more applications, and maybe they're doing some stuff in quantum computing and trying to improve the efficiency of their chips and whatnot, or data storage.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, they're sort of still confined to that narrow space. Maybe VR and some other things like that are a little bit more hardware oriented. Um, I forgot where I was going with this question.
Well, no, I see what you mean. It's this idea that, yeah, like your returns to investment are much higher right now in these fields. And that, in a sense, it's easier to focus on these things. And maybe we have neglected these other ones. I think that would be a very interesting research question to ask. How quickly was the pace of, say, materials engineering or metallurgy advancing prior to the advent of Silicon Valley, where we
Hmm.
obviously see tremendous resources going into. Um, yeah,
Well, back to my point about how these companies are qualitatively
yeah,
different. The fact that you need so few employees also means that, in terms of the economic structure and their contribution to the society in general, what you have is then you have an outsized concentration of power in a small number of
Mm-hmm.
individuals who work at these companies and operate these companies. Whereas before, the phrase used to be, what was it? What's good for Ford is good for America, or something like that. Because by their very nature, something like an auto manufacturer has to employ legions and legions of people in order to operate, and so there really is sort of a much broader base of prosperity,
Mm-hmm.
which benefits from a company like that existing in your country. Whereas someone like Facebook, not only do they have the convenience of being able to locate many of their operations overseas, they don't need to rely as much on domestic labor, uh, at least as current labor laws are instantiated. But also, the people that are still here are able to capture a tremendous amount of wealth without really having to employ that many people. And so that wealth is not actually very widely distributed as we think it might
Mm-hmm.
be. Like if you look at the top performing stocks, if the top performing stocks are all Amazon, Netflix, Facebook, all of these tech, Alphabet, all of these tech companies, there is a real sociological and political question as to how healthy is it to have so much power and so much wealth concentrated in these very, very small companies, and I mean that in terms of human bodies involved, not their
Yeah.
net, uh, not their net worth. Um, Versus more traditional companies, which, by their very nature of needing to operate more in physical space, created more broadly distributed prosperity. I think that's an interesting question that regulators and that the government should ask. I'm generally very against more regulation, but I think that's one of those areas where we might want to ask some questions about the way in which the qualitative differences between information technology companies and more traditional companies uh, is
Yeah.
distorting uh, our allocation of resources
Well,
because of the fact that they're able to capture so much.
that is a really interesting point, and one thing that's kind of unique to these companies is, yeah, their size, but also that they're effectively doing the same thing, which is trying to capture, um, you know, eyeball time on everyone's computers or phones. And I've kind of thought about this before. Like maybe it's like the case that, like, putting aside how much wealth he started with, which was quite a lot, that Elon Musk, he has these extremely overvalued companies that do deal with like physical real world systems, Tesla and SpaceX. And I think it's kind of interesting how successful they have been, given that they are like in a physical space, that they are compared to like what they're putting out overvalued. And I wonder if there isn't room for more of that.
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of criticisms of Musk that that SpaceX and Tesla are essentially uh, government subsidized
Yeah.
companies, that they wouldn't really be able to exist. I mean, to the degree that they're profitable,
Mm-hmm.
which I haven't checked the last time what Tesla's status is as far as profitability. SpaceX is even less transparent because it's a private company. Um, but that is a question. Like maybe there is a real fundamental problem with getting these companies to work in a physical
Mm-hmm.
space without severe government subsidy. And what we do about that, I'm not exactly sure, but it certainly ties into these questions of diminishing returns in the physical space. One thing I wanted to ask you about, and this will probably be our last question, just because we're nearing the end of our time here. It's been over 2 hours, so I want to be mindful of that. Is you said that you're studying cultural evolution, and there's an interesting assumption that's sort of baked into that phrase, which I think you would agree with by nature of the fact that you're studying it, but maybe you have some interesting caveats to add, which is that the assumption is that cultural artifacts and cultural institutions are subject to an evolutionary
Mm-hmm.
process. This is very similar to, let's say, Richard Dawkins' conception of memes, right? Which is that there are sort of ideas out there, and that they play a kind of evolutionary game. I mentioned Donald Hoffman earlier, who unfortunately we're not going to have time to get into today because we've covered so much ground already. But he even says that, look, he makes an even stronger claim that evolution itself, and in particular, a precise mathematical instantiation of evolution as an
Mm-hmm.
algorithm, is sort of more fundamental than a lot of the other things that we think of as being fundamental to our universe. Um, and so, if that is the case, then evolution would apply to all kinds of things, not just organic processes, not just living organisms as well. Do you think that there is reasonable ground to stand on to claim that cultural artifacts, cultural institutions, maybe even ideas themselves, are subject to evolutionary um, logic?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing is that if you look into it, what we're kind of referring to here, and what Hoffman's referring to, is this idea of the what some people call the generalized Darwinian framework, which I really don't like, because if you think about it, really, uh, biological evolution is just one unique form of evolution. You look into what Darwin was talking about with natural selection, and he actually drew a lot of his inspiration from historical linguistics, which was already happening at that time. In a sense, he looked directly at how people were examining how languages developed throughout history. And he said, you know what? Actually, I think that's how animals work as well. So he actually drew a lot of inspiration from them. And he explicitly states, not to give Darwin all this weight. People all the time, they're like, "Well, Darwin said it, so it must be real." But he said, but he said, yeah, the way that languages move throughout space and time is similarly natural selection. And the way I try to just explain it to people is, really, you have competition between different forms of something, and you have between populations of something, I guess you should say, and you have a filtering mechanism. At that point, you basically have natural selection. As soon as like things are filtered through to kind of an ideal form, that's what you get. There are ways that cultural evolution,
Was there propagation as
mm-hmm,
well?
yeah, propagation, so replication,
Okay.
yeah. So there's all kinds of ways that like cultural evolution is different from biological evolution. So, for example, Stephen Jay Gould says, well, actually, while biological evolution is not teleological, he says it might be the case that cultural evolution is. He says, there's only so many different works of art that you can make that are going to be aesthetically appreciated. There's only like so many different ways that you can improve upon, say, a hand knitting tool or something like that. That, unlike biological evolution, you do have a right wall that gets approached many times in cultural evolution. But generally, I would say these are all part of like one mechanistic framework, that you have similar mechanisms and they can be described in the same way. I don't know why you wouldn't call them evolution. People all the time shy away and they say, well, that's a terrible analogy, but it's not an analogy. This is a literal similarity. It's that these are the exact same mechanisms, just acting out in different systems.
Okay, so you believe that it's again, that it's not an
Mm-hmm.
analogy, that it's actually a direct isomorphism between the two, and because of the mathematical um, principles and processes that can describe the let's say uh, progression or proliferation
Mm-hmm.
of both.
Absolutely, they're not just similar; they're almost the same. Yeah.
And so you would take that up to the abstract level, not only on the level of ideas, or as Darwin initially referenced it, languages. I think languages is actually a very interesting angle
Mm-hmm.
there, because uh, my friend Razib Khan, the geneticist, a lot of genetics, a lot of what we understand from population genetics is actually based on shared language groups. It's one of the easiest ways to sort of trace genetic lineages is through the evolution of languages. And so that's actually a very interesting
Yeah.
intersection there between those two. um, well, Cody, this has been really awesome. I think we've given people way more than enough ideas and thoughts, and various kinds of angles and introspective questions to ask and to work with here. I don't know if anything conclusive has come out of it, but we've certainly I've certainly learned from you, and it sounds like you've learned a few things from me as well. So that's always the goal of these conversations. Before I let you go, why don't you tell me, or not me? I mean, I know. Tell them a little bit about where people might reach you if they're interested in reading your work. I know we've talked a little bit about what you're working on, but feel free to plug whatever you'd like.
Sure. Okay. You can pretty much find everything about me at culturologies.wordpress.com. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter. My handle is LTF_01. Littlefoot. It's named after my cat. It was a pseudonym for a long time, but now I just go as Cody. So it's pretty much it.
The Anon days are over.
Yeah.
Did you get doxxed by any chance? I just wanted to ask.
I get doxxed. I kind of, it was a soft dox. I had it set up in a way that if you wanted to figure out who Littlefoot was, it would be pretty easy. But if you wanted to figure out what Cody Moser had written, it would be kind of difficult. But I didn't maintain that two-way door for long, or that one-way door for long, and now it's just a two-way door. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward to us talking again. Maybe 6 months
sounds great.
from now.
Thanks, Alex.
All right.